Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to my guide on Merlin. Merlin is a stance-switching mage in SMITE with a total of 3 stances. Merlin largely centers around dealing high damage over time at a respectable range, with the ability to combo into either a more crowd control oriented or more damage oriented stance. With Merlin, there's plenty to learn, but I actually find given his range and very quick teleport movement ability, he's actually one of the safest and easiest mages to learn, even with the wealth of interactions and his abilities. He's extremely flexible with his builds. You can go heavily into pen, cooldown, or lifesteal, and they'll all feel great on him. Some notable items on him right now are things like Rod of Tahuti, Spear of the Magus, and Soul Gem. So let's hop into his abilities. Whenever Merlin casts an ability, his next auto attack will do bonus magical damage, this damage scaling with your magical power. This passive has the potential to take Merlin's already solid damage and turn it up to 11, that is, if you're able to utilize it. How well you're able to use it really depends on which stance you're in, and I'll touch on it more as we move into his abilities. But first, let's talk about Merlin's stance switch. Merlin has a set rotation for his stance switch. He starts in Arcane, switches to Fire, then to Ice stance, and you'll be switched into the next stance as soon as you activate the ability. You can, however, select the stance you want by pressing the first, second, or third ability, each one corresponding to the stances in order of their appearance in Merlin's passive. So, 1 for Arcane, 2 for Fire, and 3 for Ice stance. Additionally, once this stance has at least 1 level into it, Merlin will let out 2 AoE bursts around him, these bursts applying a base damage, with additional effects pertaining to Merlin's current and succeeding stance. Arcane stance will give a small knockup, Fire stance will apply a damage over time, and Ice stance will apply a slow. This stance switch does relatively low damage until you're well into your build, and by that time you'll usually want to use this in the same way you use it early game, very occasionally for its crowd control effects for either peel or target lockdown. Also keep in mind that this ability has a very long cooldown, especially at early levels. So just keep in mind that once you're swapped into a stance, you're going to be locked into it for a while. So make sure you've made the most out of your current stance, and then ensure that the next stance is the absolute optimal for whatever's coming next. Speaking of stances, let's get into them. Starting with Merlin's purple stance. Merlin's purple 1 is a slow moving projectile that damages anything it hits, as well as grows as it moves forward and stops moving at a designated point along its path, this point being determined by how far up your camera is pitched when the ability is activated. Once the projectile stops moving, it begins emitting AoE damage if it hits an enemy. The hitbox of this projectile is a bit finicky, and on paper this all seems pretty complicated, but honestly, even at the highest level of play, just aim the ability at the opponent and let the big circle do its thing. Merlin's 2 in Arcane stance is another decent sized AoE that, after a short windup, pulls every enemy inside of it towards the center of the AoE. So, I'm sure you can already see the combo now. Throw out your 1, then throw your 2 right afterwards to keep them in the damaging area of the 1. This stance has Merlin's best range and hardest CC, but is also lacking a bit in the damage department, so this is the stance you usually want to start in to use its range. Next up is Merlin's Fire stance. In this stance, Merlin's 1 is a channeled line AoE in front of Merlin, where he is free to move around while casting. The AoE has 2 damage phases, an initial burn, as well as a damage over time application. While the cast time is quite long and completely interruptible, this ability is still one of the hardest hitting mage abilities in the game, being able to easily half hit or even burn through 3/4 of a squishy's health once fully leveled. It's a formidable ability, but just keep in mind that it can be interrupted by any form of hard CC, so don't just go flailing around it in the team's face expecting to get a penta. Merlin's 2 in Fire stance has a decent sized ground AoE which deals significant damage over time, and shreds any god's protections within the AoE. The AoE itself isn't massive, but it's perfect for wiping out a group of minions early game or shredding through objectives like Gold Fury or Fire Giant as the game goes on. And so again, the combo is probably already clear. Throw down your 2 on a god, and then go for your 1 if it's safe, as you'll do increased damage thanks to the protection shred. As you've probably guessed, this is by far and away Merlin's highest damaging stance, but has the downside of the damage being easy to avoid as well as not applying any CC. You pretty much never want to start off a fight in this stance other than when you're trying to shred through objectives, although it's a decent choice to shift into mid-team fight if you want to start shredding and don't need to apply more CC. Finally, we have Merlin's Ice stance. In this stance, his 1 is a simple ice ball that stops when the first enemy hit, and has a small AoE explosion once it hits. This ability does alright damage, and its cast time is short enough to where an auto attack with your passive is easily achieved after tossing it out. It also has quite a low cooldown, making it a great little poke tool, and a decent way to keep your distance and still deal damage if you're stuck in Ice stance. In this stance, Merlin's 2 is a small AoE circle that deals damage over time and slows enemies. This ability does deceptively high damage, so if you or your team are able to keep enemies inside of it while you switch to your Fire or Arcane stance, targets can get shredded through very quickly. Merlin's Ice stance is his most versatile, taking the good range and CC of his Arcane stance, as well as some of the damage of the Fire stance, and wrapping them up into a sort of jack-of-all-trades stance. You may want to just switch into Ice Stance after using your arcane abilities when you're first starting out on Merlin, as it's much less volatile than the Fire Stance, and then try to learn from there where the proper times to use the Fire Stance are. In every stance, Merlin's third ability is the same. It's a simple teleport forward in the direction that Merlin is facing. This is easily one of the best movement abilities in the game, being extremely fast and flickable at the last moment to avoid enemies trying to predict you. Just keep in mind that it has a very long cooldown at early levels, and the ability itself and the cooldown are not impacted in any way by what stance you're currently using. Considering all of the possible combos with Merlin, we could be here all day discussing combos. So I'll do a basic one and then share a fun one with you. Starting in Arcane Stance. 1, 2, auto if you can, 4, 3, auto, 1, auto, 2, auto. Starting in Arcane Stance again, 1, 2, auto if you can, 4, 2, auto, 1. Then, if you have bigger balls than I do, in Arcane Stance, 1, 2, auto, 3, 4, auto, 2, auto, 1. The auto attacks in this combo aren't strictly necessary, but if you get good at utilizing Merlin's passive and understand when it's safe to go for these auto attacks, you can add hundreds if not thousands of damage to your combos. Against other mages, Merlin typically does great. As a jack of all trades character, Merlin can almost always match what the enemy mage is trying to do. Just in some cases where their CC, damage, or burst is higher than his is, he can get outclassed if they get a good swift combo. Against hunters, it can be tricky. Of course, mid-game Merlin will do absolutely fine, but in certain metas, hunters can almost always outtrade Merlin come late game if he isn't able to apply his CC. With assassins, it's a bit of a give and take. Some assassins feel like they were born to ruin Merlin's life, but others are completely unable to answer Merlin's damage and just end up getting shredded by him before they can get a kill. Warriors are, to put it nicely, a problem for Merlin. They can typically stop his fire stance damage, his only real way to damage tanks, and they also typically have enough damage to bully Merlin out of a fight. Definitely keep your distance if the enemy team's got a fed warrior on their team. Guardians are sort of the same deal, but not quite as bad since their damage is a little more lacking. You can typically try to shred them or peel them off you with Arcane Stance, and most Guardians don't have a movement ability to match Merlin's teleport like some warriors do. So that's about it for Merlin, the easiest complex character ever. If you want a mage to pick up that'll feel impactful pretty much every second of the game other than in the early game, Merlin's your guy. Just keep in mind that with severely long cooldowns and no CC immunity in his kit, you'll have to play the early game smart. Make it out of the early game though and get a few items, and you'll be flying. That's about it for my god, I'm Merlin. Anything you guys think I missed? Thanks for watching.